Crown Jewel Paradox. 1. The first time I heard it, it was not in a temple. It was under fluorescent lab lights, inside a room that smelled of cold metal and IPA wipes, where the air itself seemed to hum, mostly because the vent outside the cleanroom door always rattled at exactly the frequency that made my teeth feel like glass. I was 23, a doctoral student on paper and an unpaid custodian of a dilution refrigerator in practice. In the mornings, I was a mathematician with a neat notebook of lemmas and commutative diagrams. At night, I was a physicist crouched beside a cryostat, wondering if the universe had a sense of humor. The cryostat was a tall silver cylinder that looked like a prop from a science fiction film made by someone who had never needed to repair a leak. Inside it, suspended in nested cans of copper and superconducting shields, lay a small printed circuit board holding 8 superconducting transmon qubits, each a few millimeters of aluminum shaped into a geometry that made no intuitive sense until you remembered the only rule of the microkelvin world. Everything is an oscillator pretending to be a particle. My advisor, Dr. Meera Rao, liked to say that quantum information was the art of hearing the universe whisper while your amplifier is screaming. That night, the amplifier was not screaming. That was the problem. I sat at the control station, a pair of headphones around my neck, watching a live spectrum analyzer. On the screen, the qubit readout resonator sat like a mountain at 6.73 gigahertz. The noise floor was clean. The mixing chain was stable. The parametric amplifier, our precious Josephson device, was behaving with uncharacteristic kindness. And yet a line was there, a thin needle of power, down-converted into the audible range because our digitizer couldn't help but turn microwaves into music. I did what any self-respecting scientist does when confronted with something that feels meaningful. I assumed it was a cable. I checked the cable. Then I assumed it was the grounding. Then I assumed it was the software. Then I assumed it was the universe making a joke that required a better education than mine. Finally, at 2:11 a.m., I did the most unscientific thing I could do. I put the headphones on. The sound was faint and infuriatingly steady, not a tone like a tuning fork, more like a chord whose notes were too close together to resolve, beating against each other in slow waves, a wave of sound and rhythm. I stared at the spectrum and realized that the line was not at one frequency but several, separated by intervals that looked almost regular. Regular enough to be suspicious. Regular enough to be a message if you were the kind of person who wanted the universe to speak your language. And I was exactly that kind of person, despite my training. I am the grandson of a man who woke before sunrise to sit in a small room facing east, repeating a name under his breath until the room became so quiet he claimed he could hear Shabd. The inner sound current Saint Mat talks about as casually as engineers talk about current in copper. My grandfather would have heard that tone and smiled like a man recognizing an old friend. I heard it and felt a cold fear I didn't want to name, because part of me, some stubborn ancient part, leaned forward inside my chest and whispered, "What if this is not noise? I saved the data." Then I did something worse. I opened my notebook and wrote, as if logging a measurement, observation. There is a sound in the machine when the machine is most silent. Then beneath it, without intending to, I wrote the line my grandfather used to say in Hindi when my mind ran too fast. Dekh Dev, jitna bada dikh raha hai, utna hi chota bhi hai. Look, Dev, whatever seems vast is also small. My name is Devendra Mishra. My friends call me Dev. My enemies, if I've earned any yet, call me that boy with the Sant-Mat obsession. That night I went home at dawn, my ears still ringing with a sound the machine shouldn't have made, and my mind already doing what minds do when they are young, clever, and spiritually compromised. I began building a theory. 2 weeks later I was in Hathras, not because of the lab, not officially. Officially I was on family leave. My mother's cousin was getting married, and my mother, who loved me the way religious people love their skeptical children, with equal parts prayer and exasperation, had insisted I come. So I took a train north, away from Bengaluru's silicon and glass, toward a winter haze that smelled of burning crop waste and frying sweets. Hathras was not a place I associated with cosmology. It was a place of dusty lanes, marigold garlands, and my grandfather's stories, Tulsi Sahib of Hathras. I had grown up hearing the name with the same casual reverence I heard for Ramanujan and Einstein, as if poets and physicists belonged to the same guild of people who peek behind the curtain. On the second day, while the house filled with wedding noise, I escaped to the smallest room, the old storeroom where my grandfather used to keep his books. My hands moved without thinking, lifting a wooden trunk that smelled of camphor and paper. Inside were notebooks with my grandfather's careful Devanagari script, a few faded photographs, and a thin, brittle pamphlet with a simple cover, Tulsi Sahib, Barney. I sat on the floor. Outside, someone shouted about missing bangles. A child laughed. A pressure cooker hissed like steam from a miniature volcano. And inside the storeroom, I opened the pamphlet and read, "The soul hears a wave of sound and rhythm, and opens the door, unspeakable, indescribable. Going beyond rhythm and sight, one enters the gate of the tower of emptiness. Then one sees the sound current issuing forth hundreds of thousands of universes, and sound penetrates to the middle of them all, their crown jewel, which is tiny as an insect." I read it once, then again, slower, as if the words had hidden parameters. Wave, rhythm, door, tower of emptiness, hundreds of thousands of universes, a sound current issuing forth, and at the center, their crown jewel, something tiny as an insect. My chest tightened in a way I recognized. It was the same feeling I had the first time I understood a proof, that clean snap when scattered intuition becomes structure. But this wasn't a proof. This was a poem, and yet it felt like a blueprint. I closed my eyes. In the dark behind my eyelids, the hum from the cryostat returned. Not exactly the same, but close enough that my skin prickled. A thought rose in me like a rash, not outside, not the very large, not galaxies and cosmic horizons and expanding space, but the smallest thing possible, below the Planck scale where we say physics breaks, where space-time itself might be meaningless, where all our equations are just polite lies. My mind, trained in physics, immediately objected. Planck's constant isn't a size, Dev. The Planck length is. And below that is not a place you can point to. It's a regime where our current theories stop being trustworthy. Another part of me, the part that still smelled incense on winter mornings, answered, "Exactly. That's why it's the door." That afternoon I carried the pamphlet into the courtyard, where my grandfather sat in the sun in an old shawl, watching wedding chaos like it was theatre staged for his amusement. He was older now, thinner. His eyes were still bright. He saw the pamphlet and nodded as if he'd been waiting for it. "You found Tulsi," he said. I sat beside him. "Dadaji, what does he mean by tiny as an insect?" My grandfather looked at me, then out at the street, where a scooter honked at a cow with the offended dignity of a saint. "He means," my grandfather said slowly, "that what you are looking for will never be found in the place you are searching." "That sounds like a riddle," I said. "It is," he replied. "All the good truths are." I hesitated. In physics, we say the smallest meaningful length is the Planck length. Below that, our equations fail. My grandfather smiled. "And what happens when your equations fail?" "You make new equations." "And what happens when you fail?" he asked. I frowned. "I don't understand." "You stop pretending," he said gently. "You listen." I swallowed. "Listen to what?" He tapped the pamphlet. "The sound that is there when everything else is quiet." I almost laughed. Instead, I stared at the sunlit dust motes, each one drifting like a tiny universe. I heard myself ask, too softly, "What if it's the same thing, Dadaji? The sound in meditation, and the noise in my machines?" My grandfather didn't answer right away. Then he said, "If it is the same, you will not be able to prove it the way you prove a theorem." "That's unacceptable," I said automatically, and he laughed. "Then you will suffer beautifully," he replied, "like all clever boys." 3. Back in Bengaluru, Dr. Meera Rao listened to my story with the expression she reserved for two situations: grant committee meetings and students announcing revelations. Meera was not unkind. She was sharper than any scalpel I'd ever seen, and kinder than her reputation suggested. She wore plain clothes, drank her coffee black, and could reduce a confused argument to its bones with a single question. She held my printed spectrogram up to the light as if the noise might reveal itself in the paper grain. "This line," she said. "This is what you're calling the hum?" "Yes." "And you heard it," she said, "as sound. Only after down conversion." "And you think," she said carefully, "that a 19th century Sant-Mat poet is describing a sub-Planckian origin of reality." I braced for the dismissal. Mira leaned back in her chair. Behind her, the whiteboard was still filled with diagrams of tensor networks and the words error correction equals geometry scribbled like a dare. "Dev," she said, "I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm going to tell you what physics says." "Okay." "Physics says we can't meaningfully talk about distances smaller than the Planck length in the same way we talk about meters. To probe a length scale L, you need energies on the order of hc over L. If L is too small, the energy you concentrate in that region collapses into a black hole. So the attempt to look closer changes the thing you're looking at." I nodded. "Yes, the black hole argument." "Good. So if there is a secret below the Planck scale," she continued, "it's not going to be a hidden marble sitting in tiny space. It's going to be a different kind of description altogether. Pre-geometric, information theoretic, something like that." She gestured toward the board. "That's why we talk about holography. Why we talk about space-time emerging from entanglement. Why we build toy models where geometry is an error-correcting code." She paused. Her gaze sharpened. "So here's the question. Are you bringing me mysticism as a substitute for rigor, or are you bringing it as a source of questions you can test?" The relief I felt was absurdly strong. "Test," I said. "I want to test." Mira nodded once. "Then we proceed like scientists. We do not worship our hypotheses." I swallowed, then asked the question that had been burning my throat since Hathras. "How do I test something that might not be in space-time?" Mira's mouth twitched. "Welcome to quantum gravity." She stood and walked to the board, drawing a tower of squares, layers stacked on layers. "This is a renormalization group flow," she said. "You coarse grain. You integrate out degrees of freedom. You move from microscopic to macroscopic descriptions. If space-time emerges, it might emerge along something like this flow, a tower of emptiness, if you want to be poetic." My skin prickled. Mira pointed at the bottom of the tower. "At the deepest level, what you have are not things in space. You have algebraic relations. You have constraints. You have a state, a Hilbert space, an operator algebra, and maybe a code." She turned to me. "If you want a two-pronged adventure, Dev, I'll give you one. In the lab, we'll build and run a holographic code on our quantum processor. In your head, you can do whatever your tradition recommends, as long as you don't compromise your mental health or your data integrity." "I won't," I said quickly. Mira held my gaze. "And you will keep one thing sacred." "What?" "The null hypothesis." I almost smiled. But that night, when I sat alone in my room, the pamphlet open beside my laptop, my mind refused to let go. The poem wasn't claiming that God lived in a small place. It was claiming something more disturbing, that the origin was not outside the universes, but inside the smallest center of them all. Not big versus small as spatial categories, but as modes of access. As if the vastness of cosmos was an output, not the source. As if the creator was not a giant engineer in the sky, but the tiniest invariant in the code. A crown jewel, tiny as an insect, and if it was an invariant, then it might be mathematical. 4. I built my tools the way I built my faith, reluctantly, with too much precision. My first tool was a super AI system we called Saraswati, an internal platform maintained by the Institute's computation group. It wasn't a chatbot. It was closer to an ecosystem, a retrieval engine over papers and code bases, a symbolic algebra system, a theorem-proving assistant, and a program synthesis module that could generate verified implementations. Mira hated hype, so she called it an expensive calculator with good manners. The first time I used it seriously, I fed it a description. Given a tensor network code that maps boundary qubits to bulk degrees of freedom, compute entanglement, wedge reconstruction maps for small subsystems, and identify minimal logical operators. Saraswati responded with a plan, a set of references, and most importantly, code that compiled. It also asked me, politely, "Do you intend to formally verify the reconstruction properties?" I stared at the message. Formal verification, as in, prove in a proof assistant that the code's logical structure satisfied the properties, as in, no hand-waving, as in, my favorite kind of suffering. So I opened Lean, the proof assistant, and began. My second tool was a quantum processor, not ours. Ours was small, noisy, and temperamentally religious. It punished arrogance. But we had access to a national-scale superconducting quantum machine through a partnership. Hundreds of physical qubits, real-time error syndrome extraction, a decent surface code patch that could hold a handful of logical qubits for seconds at a time, an eternity in that world. We designed a set of experiments. 1. Implement a holographic code, a variant inspired by happy tensor network constructions, on logical qubits. 2. Inject a bulk logical message into the code. 3. Probe reconstruction from different boundary regions, showing that the same interior can be recovered from multiple views, like a sound penetrating to the middle of them all. 4. Analyze syndrome patterns, the voice of error correction as time series. My third tool was less respectable. It was a small notebook I kept for meditation. Every day before the lab, I sat in the dark for 40 minutes. I had tried meditation before, the way stressed students try yoga, as a hack. Sant Mat was different. It wasn't mindfulness. It was a practice with a direction, a cosmology, and a stubborn insistence that the most important data was not public. My grandfather had called it Surat Shabd Yoga, the union of attention, Surat with inner sound, Shabd. He had taught me two practices, Simran, repetition of a mantra or name, not to appease a god, but to focus attention until it became sharp enough to cut through thought. Bhajan, listening inward without chasing until sound emerged. I did not have a living guru I fully trusted. I had met teachers, but my scientific training made me allergic to claims. Still, I had grown up around satsang enough to know the basic discipline. You do the work, and you don't brag about the results. If something happens, you treat it as data, not identity. So I sat. I repeated the name quietly, and I listened. At first it was nothing. Blood in my ears, the faint electrical buzz of nerves, the mind's endless commentary. Then one night, 3 weeks into the routine, something shifted. It was not dramatic. It was like the moment your eyes adjust to darkness. A tone appeared high and clean, as if a flute had been playing far away. I held my attention on it the way I held a laser on a cavity resonance. The tone wavered, then strengthened. Beneath it, like a foundation, a deeper sound rolled, like thunder heard through stone. Wave, rhythm. I did not interpret it as God. I did not interpret it as hallucination. I wrote in my notebook, phenomenology, stable tone plus low frequency roar. Attention increases clarity, thought disrupts. Then I went to the lab and tried to pretend I was still a rational person. 5. You look like you've seen a ghost, Anaya said. She had followed me into the lab that morning with the casual entitlement of someone who belonged everywhere. Anaya Sen was a neuroscientist at Nimhans, and she treated physics labs the way physicists treat fMRI suites, as exotic spaces full of expensive machines and fragile egos. She and I had met at a seminar on predictive coding, the theory that the brain is a hierarchical inference engine minimizing prediction error. She had asked a question about quantum probability models in cognition. I had answered too eagerly. She'd cornered me afterward and said, "You're either brilliant or unbearable. Which is it?" We became friends the way people become friends when they suspect the other person might help them survive their own mind. She leaned against the doorframe and watched me type. "What's wrong?" she asked. I hesitated. Then I told her the short version. The hum in the cryostat, Tulsi Sahib, the meditation. Anaya listened without smiling. When I finished, she nodded slowly and said, "Okay." "Okay," I repeated. "That's it?" "Dev," she said. "The brain is a pattern-matching machine with a talent for religious awe, but it's also a measurement device. If you want to treat your meditation like data, we can instrument it. I stared. Instrument it how? EEG for starters, she said. High density. We can look at oscillatory dynamics, cross-frequency coupling, source localization if we're careful. We can see what happens to your auditory cortex networks when you report inner sound. That won't tell us whether it's real, I said. Anaya shrugged. Define real. It will tell us whether it's systematic, whether it correlates with specific brain states. And if you want to get weird, she grinned, and for the first time the mischief appeared. We can try closed-loop neurofeedback, train you to stabilize that state, or use VR sensory deprivation to reduce external prediction error, amplify interoceptive perception. That's basically a modern version of going into a cave. My pulse quickened. Mira would hate this, I thought. Then I remembered Mira's rule, test. Fine, I said, but if you turn this into a TED talk about enlightenment, I will delete your grant applications. Anaya laughed. Deal. That week we began a collaboration that made both departments suspicious. In the mornings I ran quantum circuits and wrote proofs with Saraswati's help. At night I sat in Anaya's lab wearing a dense EEG cap coated with cold gel, staring into a VR headset that rendered a vast black space with a single point of light. The VR program was mine. I called it Shunya Tower, not because I believed in mystical towers, because the name reminded me not to treat emptiness as absence. In mathematics, emptiness is structure, the null set, the vacuum state, the ground on which everything else stands. In VR, I built an environment that minimized sensory features. No textures, no scenery, just darkness and a faint, almost imperceptible pulse of light synchronized to my breath. Anaya watched my EEG traces on a monitor, her eyes bright. Your default mode network markers drop when you lock onto the tone, she said one night. You can tell that from EEG? I asked skeptically. She rolled her eyes. Not directly, but we can infer network-level dynamics. Also, your gamma coherence increases, and there's a very clean theta-gamma coupling when you report the flute. That's interesting. Or it means I'm imagining it, I said. Or it means your attention is stabilizing a perception, she replied. Either way, it's data. Then she leaned closer, voice lowered. And Dev, I've seen people in deep meditation show auditory-like cortical activation without external sound. It's not magic. The brain can generate percepts, but the regularity is what matters. Regularity, I echoed, thinking of the cryostat line. Anaya nodded. If your internal sound current has a stable spectral signature, we can compare it to anything else you're measuring. Anything else, like the hum in my machine. The thought landed in me like a stone. 6. We did the obvious thing first. We tried to kill the hum. I changed every cable. I replaced the attenuators. I recalibrated the mixers. I isolated the vibration sources. I checked the lab's power line harmonics. I even hunted down the building's elevator motor schedule like a man tracking a predator. The hum remained. Not always. Not at the same amplitude. But it appeared often enough to insult my confidence. One evening, Mira sat with me at the control station watching the spectrum. You want it to mean something, she said. I flinched. I want it to be explainable. Same thing sometimes, she said. Have you correlated it with anything? I hesitated. Not yet. Mira turned to me. Dev, you can't treat anomalies like poetry. Do the statistics. So I did. I wrote a pipeline in Python, then rewrote the critical pieces in JAX for speed. Saraswati helped optimize the spectral estimators. I used Bayesian change-point detection to identify when the hum appeared. I cross-correlated it with logged parameters. Temperature, magnetic field, qubit frequencies, amplifier bias, lab humidity, even seismic data from a public sensor. Nothing. Then, half out of desperation, I added one more variable. Meditation sessions? Yes, no, I expected nothing. The correlation was weak but persistent, a slight increase in hum amplitude within an hour of my late-night meditation sessions. It could have been coincidence. It could have been my schedule. It could have been a confounder. I meditated late, and the building's HVAC cycle changed late. But it was enough to do what science always does when faced with a pattern that might be meaningful. It made me hungry. On the day the first real breakthrough happened, it began with a math mistake. I was working in Lean, formalizing a small lemma about operator algebras in the holographic code model. Saraswati had suggested a shortcut. Treat a certain map as an isometry and proceed. I knew it was dangerous. I did it anyway. Lean rejected the proof with the moral clarity of a machine that has never needed approval. I stared, annoyed, and rewrote the argument properly. In doing so, I noticed something. The code's reconstruction property depended on a set of stabilizer constraints, conditions that were essentially checks. These checks were not just mathematical. In a real quantum computer, they are measured repeatedly as error syndromes, a string of plus or minus one outcomes over time. In our experiments, those syndrome strings were data that, when plotted, looked like noise. But noise with structure that error correction uses to keep logical information intact, a sound current issuing forth. I leaned back and thought, what if the hum I heard was not mystical? What if it was literally the audible projection of syndrome dynamics, a ghost of error correction made musical by my brain's insistence on narrative? I brought this to Mira. She listened, then nodded sharply. That's plausible and testable. How? I asked. We run the holographic code on the quantum machine, she said, and we record syndrome time series with high resolution. Then we do spectral analysis. We check whether the hum frequencies correspond to dominant modes in syndrome evolution. And if they do? I asked. Mira's expression was cautious. Then you have a mundane explanation for the hum. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt disappointment, then shame at the disappointment, then anger at the shame. My grandfather's voice returned. You will suffer beautifully. We ran the experiment. The next week, we implemented a small holographic code variant on the national machine, a network encoding one bulk logical qubit into many boundary physical qubits. We injected a message state, nothing mystical, just a quantum state with known block vector. We ran repeated stabilizer measurements, we extracted syndrome strings, we did the spectral analysis, and we found something that made the room go silent. There was a dominant low-frequency mode in the syndrome dynamics, an emergent beat frequency caused by the interplay of two noise processes and the periodicity of the measurement cycle. When down-converted and listened to, it sounded like a faint chord whose notes were too close together to resolve. Wave, rhythm, my hum. Mira exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath she'd been holding for weeks. Okay, she said. That explains it. Anaya didn't look satisfied. Explains what? She asked. The hum in the lab, Mira replied. It's an artifact of error correction cycles and noise. If Dev is hearing it, it's because his system converts measurement data into audio and his brain gives it meaning. Anaya folded her arms. Except the hum also appeared when the error correction experiments weren't running. Mira frowned. Then it's another artifact. Anaya's eyes sharpened. Or we're seeing the same pattern in different places because the pattern is deeper. Mira looked at me. I should have sided with Mira. The scientist in me wanted closure. But another part of me, quiet, stubborn, whispered, even if it's an artifact, why does it feel like a door? I said carefully, even if the lab hum is syndrome dynamics, Tulsi Sahib's poem wasn't describing my electronics. Mira's expression softened in a way that surprised me. No, she said, but maybe he was describing something structurally similar. Similar how? I asked. Mira turned to the whiteboard and wrote one word, spectrum. Sound, she said, is a spectrum. In physics, what we often care about is a spectrum, energy eigenvalues, entanglement spectra, modular Hamiltonians. Many deep structures reveal themselves as spectral patterns. She paused, then added, almost reluctantly, and the brain is a spectral machine. Oscillations, rhythms, synchrony. Anaya nodded slowly. So you're saying the sound current could be a metaphor for spectral flow through levels of description? Mira tapped the board. Renormalization, coarse graining, tower. The tower of emptiness, I whispered. Mira shot me a warning glance, but she didn't erase the phrase. That night I meditated with a new kind of attention. not as a believer hunting God, as a mathematician hunting invariance. I listened inward and heard the flute tone again, but this time I asked a different question. If this is a spectrum, what is it a spectrum of? And as if in response, the tone shifted, it deepened, broadened, became layered, like harmonics appearing. When a system locks into resonance, I felt my sense of me loosen slightly, like a knot relaxing, and I saw behind the sound not with eyes but with an intuition that felt more precise than sight, a kind of structure, levels upon levels, each emptier than the last, each more silent, until silence itself seemed like a doorway, a gate, a tower of emptiness. I opened my eyes, shaking. In the notebook I wrote, hypothesis, speculative. Meditation may access internal representations that mirror hierarchical compression, RG-like. Inner sound may correspond to stable attractor dynamics in neural predictive coding. Subjective going inward feels like moving along scale. Then I added, almost as an afterthought, but why does it feel like it's not just in my brain? 8. The first time I met Satguru Prakash Singh, he disappointed me. He was not radiant. He did not speak in riddles. He did not seem like the kind of man who carried secret universes in his eyes. He was old, yes, but not theatrically. He wore a simple sweater and sat on a plastic chair in a modest hall on the outskirts of the city. People came, bowed, sat, listened. There were no fireworks. I had gone because my grandfather insisted over the phone. "Just meet him," he said. "You don't have to believe. Just look." So I went, expecting either fraud or wisdom. What I got was something worse: normality. After satsang, a volunteer led me to a small room where the guru sat with a cup of tea. He looked at me and said, "Devendra." I stiffened. "You know my name?" "My students know your grandfather," he said. His voice was gentle, not mystical. "And you have his eyes." I sat, awkward. He studied me for a moment, then asked the question I didn't expect. "What do you want?" I almost laughed. "Truth," he nodded. "And what will you do if you find it?" "Prove it," I said immediately. The guru's eyes crinkled. "Good luck," I bristled. "You think that's arrogant." "I think it's young," he said, "and not wrong. But you must understand, the highest things cannot be proved the way you prove a theorem, not because they are irrational, but because the instrument of proof is itself part of what is being examined." "That's convenient," I said. The guru smiled. "So is your skepticism." I leaned forward. "I'm a physicist. In my field, when we can't probe something directly, we build models and test their consequences. We do not declare the unknown holy." He nodded. "Excellent. Then do not declare it holy." I hesitated. I read Tulsi Sahib. The line about the sound current issuing universes and the crown jewel tiny as an insect. The guru's face did not change, but his gaze sharpened, as if he were listening more carefully than before. "You think it's about physics," he said. "I think it might be about something deeper than physics," I said, surprising myself. He sipped his tea. Tulsi was describing an inward journey. He used the language available to him. You want to translate it into your language. "Is that wrong?" I asked. "It's dangerous," he said, "because you might mistake the map for the territory, or you might become proud of your map." I felt heat rise in my face. The guru set his cup down. "Devendra," he said, "in Sant Mat we say, the sound is not the goal, it is the rope. You hold it and it pulls you. If you make it into an object of worship, you will stop moving." "Then what is the goal?" I asked. The guru's answer was almost disappointingly simple. "To become small enough," he said, "to pass through the door." My breath caught. Small enough. Tiny as an insect. I wanted to ask him if he believed God was below the Planck scale. The absurdity made me almost smile. Instead, I asked, "How do I know I'm not just hallucinating? The brain can generate sounds." The guru nodded. "Yes, the brain can generate many things, but there is a difference between the mind's noise and the sound that changes you." "That's not scientific," I said. "It is experiential," he corrected. "Science also begins in experience. Do the practice, observe the effects. Do not lie to yourself." I left the hall feeling strangely hollow, not enlightened, not convinced, but challenged in a way my equations never challenged me. That night, I told Mira about the meeting. She listened, then said, "Just don't let anyone exploit you." "I won't," I said. She studied me. "Dev, are you okay?" I nodded. "I'm split." "Between what?" "Between wanting the universe to be impersonal," I said slowly, "and wanting it to be intimate." Mira's gaze softened. "Both can be true," she said quietly, "but not in the way you want." 9. The mystery deepened in the most irritating way, by becoming useful. We were running the holographic code experiments more seriously now. Mira had managed to get a small internal grant by framing it as quantum error correction architectures inspired by holographic duality. Grant committees love anything with "inspired by" in the title. Saraswati helped us optimize circuits, minimizing depth under hardware constraints. We used variational compilation, then validated with randomized benchmarking and logical fidelity estimates. But the surprising part came from analyzing the syndrome patterns. Anaya, who had no patience for my poetic language, treated the syndrome strings like neural data, time series with hidden structure. She applied methods from computational neuroscience, hidden Markov models, spectral clustering, recurrence plots. And she found that the syndrome dynamics, when the code was in a stable logical state, had a kind of signature, a stable attractor, not just random noise, a dynamical pattern that held the logical qubit's integrity. "It's like homeostasis," she said, tapping a plot. Mira frowned. "It's error correction." "Same concept," Anaya replied. "A system maintaining a state against perturbation." Then Anaya did something that made my skin crawl. She took my EEG data from deep meditation sessions, the ones where I reported the strongest inner sound, and ran the same analysis. She found attractor-like patterns there too, not identical, of course. Biology is messy, but structurally similar. Neural dynamics stabilizing into a regime with characteristic spectral features. Anaya looked at me. "Dev, your brain, in deep listening, is doing something like error correction. It's maintaining a stable internal state against the noise of thought." My mouth went dry. Mira sat back, hands steepled. "So you're suggesting the subjective sound current is an experiential correlate of a brain settling into a low-entropy attractor state?" Anaya shrugged. "That's one interpretation." "And the poem," Mira said slowly, "could be describing what it feels like to move through layers of attractors toward a deeper, more stable one. Tower, emptiness, gate." I swallowed. "And the tiny insect?" Anaya smiled faintly. "The minimal stable core," Mira frowned. "Or the self-model." I felt my stomach twist. Because that was the horrifying possibility, that the crown jewel was not some divine particle, but the smallest, stubbornest illusion of all. The sense of I. A tiny insect sitting at the center of everything, convinced it was the universe's crown. I couldn't sleep that night. When I closed my eyes, I heard the flute tone, and beneath it I felt the self clenching, afraid of being dissolved. At 3 a.m. I opened the Tulsi Sahib pamphlet again and reread the line. "Sound penetrates to the middle of them all, their crown jewel, which is tiny as an insect. Penetrates to the middle, not enlarges the middle, not glorifies it, penetrates it, as if the sound passes through the center and keeps going, beyond even the thing that thinks it is central." I sat up in bed, trembling. If that was true, then the insect was not the goal. It was the last obstacle. And the creator, if that word meant anything, was not the insect, but what remains when even the insect is gone. The next morning I told Anaya I wanted to do something reckless. She raised an eyebrow. "Define reckless." "I want to synchronize," I said. "Synchronous? What with what?" "My meditation session with a live quantum run," I said. "Same time, same room. You monitor EEG. The quantum machine runs the holographic code. We record syndrome patterns. We see if anything correlates beyond chance." Mira would say no, I thought. But when I told Mira, she didn't say no. She stared at me, then said, "If we do this, we do it cleanly." "Randomization," Anaya said immediately. "Control conditions," Mira added. "Pre-registration," Anaya said, grinning. Mira glared. "Don't get excited." I didn't feel excited. I felt like I was walking toward a door that might open into brilliance or madness. 10. We ran the synchronized protocol for 10 sessions. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no miraculous spikes, no cosmic voices, no Sanskrit appearing in syndrome readouts, just subtle statistical tilts, enough to keep doubt alive, enough to keep obsession fed. And then on the 11th session, something happened that I still can't explain in a way that satisfies my training. It was a night. I sat in the adjacent office, EEG cap on, eyes closed, repeating the name softly until thought thinned. In the next room, the quantum processor runs streamed syndrome data into our system. Anaya watched both monitors. Mira watched the syndrome integrity metrics. I listened inward. The flute tone arrived quickly as if waiting. Beneath it, a roar like distant thunder. My attention held steady, and then, without warning, the sound changed. It was no longer a tone. It was like a current, like something moving, not in space, but through attention. And as it moved, something in me opened, an internal door, unspeakable and indescribable, not because it was mystical, but because language was too slow. I felt myself falling inward, not falling like in a dream, but receding from the surface layer where I usually lived. Thoughts tried to follow, and couldn't. Behind the sound, darkness deepened. A gate. The tower of emptiness, not as a visual, but as a sense of descending through levels, each level quieter, simpler, more fundamental. Anaya's voice seemed far away, muffled. "Dev," she said softly, "what are you experiencing?" I couldn't answer. Then I saw something. Not with eyes, with the same faculty that sees mathematical structure before symbols. It looked like universes, not planets and stars, but bubble-like structures, each a coherent whole, branching and folding. Hundreds of thousands, maybe more, each one an entire possibility space. And through them the sound current ran, not around them, but through their centers, penetrating, unifying, indifferent to their variety. At the very middle, where the sound seemed to converge, there was something tiny, a point, a jewel, an insect, so small it was almost insulting, and yet the entire architecture seemed to depend on it, the way a complex proof can hinge on a single axiom. I felt an impulse to grab it, to claim it, to shout, "This is it, the secret." The impulse was the insect itself. And the sound current, gentle, inexorable, passed right through that impulse, dissolving it the way water dissolves salt. For a moment there was no me to interpret, only a kind of vast, clean presence. Not emotional, not personal, not impersonal either, it simply was. And then the world snapped back. I gasped, eyes flying open, heart pounding. Anaya stared at her monitors, face pale. Mira had stood up. "What?" I croaked. Anaya's voice trembled slightly. "Dev, your EEG, it's—" Mira cut in. "Look!" She turned the monitor toward me. On the syndrome data plot, at the exact timestamp of my gasp, there was a shift. Not huge, but distinct. The dominant low-frequency syndrome mode, the one that produced the hum, had phase-locked briefly into a cleaner pattern, then returned to baseline. Mira's face was tight. "That shouldn't happen," Anaya whispered. "It's like entrainment." My mouth went dry. Mira turned to me slowly. "Did you move? Did you touch anything? Did you breathe differently?" I I don't know," I said, shaking. "I was gone." Anaya was already pulling up heart rate data. "Your breathing slowed. Then there's a sudden inhale." Mira's jaw clenched. "We need to check for electrical interference." We checked everything. No interference, no obvious confounder, nothing that made us comfortable. Mira sat back down, rubbing her temples. "Okay," she said finally, voice controlled. "We do not declare victory. We do not declare mystery solved. We replicate." Anaya nodded, eyes shining with a scientist's hunger. I sat very still, my body buzzing. Inside my skull, the sound current still seemed present, faint but undeniable. And beneath all the excitement and fear, a thought rose, quiet and cold. If the insect was the impulse to claim the secret, then the secret was not something I could own. It was something that owned me. 11 replication is where romance goes to die. We tried to reproduce the phase-locking event. It didn't happen again, not like that. Sometimes the hum mode shifted slightly, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes my meditation was deep. Sometimes it was restless. The data was messy, like life. Mira grew more skeptical. Anaya grew more obsessed. I oscillated between them like a particle in a double-well potential. In the midst of this, Saraswati did what super AIs do when you feed them too much data. It found patterns no human asked for. One morning, I opened my terminal and saw a message. Unrequested analysis complete. Syndrome time series. Symbolic compression yielded low description length motifs. Motifs correlate with prime-indexed intervals. I blinked. Prime-indexed intervals? I pulled up the report. Saraswati had applied a compression-based analysis to the syndrome strings, searching for motifs that reduced description length, an information-theoretic way to detect structure beyond random noise. It found motifs, faint but consistent, and the spacing between motif recurrences approximated prime gaps. It was not exact, not perfect, but close enough to make my stomach drop. Because prime numbers were my first love. Before physics, before quantum machines, before Saint Mat, I had been a boy in Varanasi, scribbling primes in a notebook the way other children collected cricket cards. I ran to Mira. She skimmed the report, then sighed. This is probably a multiple comparisons artifact. Probably, I agreed, but the word probably did not soothe me. Anaya joined us, and when she saw the prime gap mentioned, she laughed once, sharp and delighted. Oh, she said. Of course, Mira glared. Don't encourage him. Anaya raised her hands. I'm not. I'm just saying, if there is a deep structural mapping between quantum codes and mathematics, primes are going to show up. They're everywhere. Mira rubbed her forehead. Dev, what are you thinking? I hesitated, then admitted the thought that had been haunting me since Hathras. What if the sub-Planck secret isn't a smaller distance, I said, but a smaller distinction? Mira frowned. Explain. In physics, we talk about Planck length as a limit because space-time becomes fuzzy, I said. But what if the fundamental thing isn't length? What if it's information? A yes, no, a qubit, a minimal logical element. Anaya nodded slowly. Mira's eyes narrowed. You're drifting into it from bit. Yes, I said, but with a twist. The poem says the crown jewel is tiny as an insect, not because it's spatially small, but because it's conceptually minimal, the smallest unit of agency, the smallest thing that can choose a branch. Mira leaned back. So your creator is a minimal logical qubit, I swallowed, or the rule that makes qubits meaningful, the axiom, the constraint, the stabilizer, Anaya whispered, almost reverently, the check that holds the code. Mira stared at the whiteboard, then wrote 2 words, Gödel/holography. She turned to me. Dev, do you know what happens when you try to build a theory that contains its own proof of completeness? My throat tightened. Incompleteness, Mira nodded. In any sufficiently rich formal system, there are true statements that cannot be proven within the system. If reality is a system that contains observers reasoning about reality, there may be an analog, a core that can't be derived from within. Anaya's eyes widened. A creator that is not outside, but is the unprovable axiom inside. I felt cold, tiny as an insect, not a thing in space, a logical seed, a fixed point, a door that cannot be opened from inside by force, only by becoming small enough. Mira's voice was quiet. If you try to prove God as a theorem of physics, you might be chasing an impossibility, but you might still discover something profound about the limits of explanation. I sat down hard. Outside the lab, campus life continued, students arguing, scooters honking, tea vendors shouting. Inside, my world narrowed to an unbearable question. Was the sound current a metaphor for the flow of information through scales? Or was it a literal contact with the system's unprovable core? And if it was unprovable, what would count as evidence? 12. The surprising ending did not arrive in the lab. It arrived in a file. 3 months into our work, long after the first thrill had dulled into routine, Saraswati sent me a system notification at 1:17 a.m. Alert: anomalous payload detected in archived raw data. Compression analysis suggests steganographic encoding. I stared at the message. Steganographic? As in Hidden message inside noise. My heart hammered. This was absurd. Data pipelines do not hide poetry. Noise does not carry intention unless I stop myself. Mira's rule. Do not worship hypotheses. I opened the file. It was from my very first night, the night I heard the hum and wrote sound in the machine when the machine is most silent. Saraswati had flagged it because the noise statistics were slightly off, too structured, too compressible. I ran the decoding routine. What emerged was not a clear sentence. It was a string of bits with a faint pattern. Saraswati suggested an interpretive map. Treat bit blocks as indices. Map indices to a corpus. What corpus? I whispered. Saraswati answered. Corpus options evaluated. Sanskrit phonemes, English letters, ASCII, Devanagari syllabary, known Santmat Bani transcripts. Highest posterior, Tulsi Sahib Bani corpus. My mouth went dry. I selected the Tulsi Sahib corpus option. The system produced output, a paragraph, not perfectly. Some words were garbled, but enough was clear that my skin broke into gooseflesh. It was the same excerpt I had read in Hathras. Not exactly, but unmistakable. The soul hears a wave of sound and rhythm. I stared at the screen until my eyes watered. This was impossible. The file was from before my trip to Hathras, from before I had opened the pamphlet, from before I had read the poem. I ran the metadata, verified timestamps, verified checksums, verified logs, no tampering. No human had injected this, not in any obvious way. I stumbled into Mira's office at dawn, shaking, and handed her the printout. Mira read it once, then again. Her face went pale in a way I had never seen. This is, she began, then stopped. Anaya arrived later and took one look and swore softly. Either, she said, someone is playing a very elaborate prank, or reality is weirder than our definitions. Mira's voice was tight. Dev, did you ever at any point feed Tulsi Sahib text into any system connected to the lab network? No, I said. I didn't even have it digitized. Mira stared at the printout as if it were radioactive. Then she did something that startled me more than the anomaly. She laughed, not joyfully, not mockingly, as if she'd reached the edge of her mental map and found a cliff. What? I demanded. Mira looked at me, eyes bright with something like fear and wonder. Dev, she said quietly, do you realize what the most conservative explanation is? My throat tightened. What? That you are not reading a message from outside, she said. You're reading a message from inside, from your own interpretive system, from Saraswati's pattern matching, from your brain's hunger. Anaya nodded slowly. Apophenia at cosmic scale. My stomach dropped. So, it's nothing. Mira held up a hand. No, listen, even if it's just pattern matching, there's still a question. Why this pattern? Why this poem? Why a mapping that prefers this corpus? Why does it align with your personal trajectory? I swallowed, voice small. Because I wanted it to. Mira stared at me. Or because something in your environment seeded it. Anaya leaned forward. Or because the poem itself is a stable attractor in cultural information space, like a meme with high compressibility, like a spectral motif. Mira's eyes narrowed. And, Anaya added softly, Dev, you heard the hum before you read the poem. Maybe your brain was already tuned and the poem simply named what you were already experiencing. I felt dizzy. That interpretation was safe, psychological, cultural, and yet it didn't explain the file, unless the message was not in the file at all until we decoded it. Unless decoding was creation. My mind snapped back to Mira's incompleteness comment. A system cannot prove its own completeness. An observer cannot step outside the universe to verify the universe. Maybe the creator was not a being transmitting text. Maybe the creator was the boundary condition that makes meaning possible at all. Meaning emerges when interpretation occurs. The door opens from the inside, tiny as an insect. I left the lab and walked without direction until I found myself in a small park near campus, sitting under a tree as morning traffic roared. My phone rang. It was my grandfather. His voice was thin but steady. Dev, he said, did you find what you were looking for? I almost laughed. I almost cried. I found, I began, then stopped. How do you tell a man that your quantum machine seems to have whispered his poet's lines? Instead, I said, Dadaji, what if the creator is not outside the universe, not inside it either, but in the act of making meaning? My grandfather was silent for a long moment. Then he said softly, Dev, Tulsi Sahib did not say the crown jewel is the sound. No, I whispered. He said sound penetrates to the crown jewel, my grandfather continued. And the crown jewel is tiny. The smallest thing, I swallowed. The smallest thing, my grandfather said, is attention. My breath caught. Attention. The instrument of observation, the thing physics cannot remove from its own story, the surat that joins shabd. Tiny as an insect, yet it crowns universes because without it universes are not experienced. I closed my eyes. For the first time in months, I did not try to solve anything. I listened. The tone came, faint, the roar beneath, wave and rhythm, a door handle in the dark. And for a moment I understood something that felt like a punchline delivered by the cosmos. I had been chasing below Planck as if it were a smaller place. But the poem was never about a smaller place. It was about a smaller self. The sub-Planck realm is not a distance you reach by brute force. It is a regime you reach by relinquishing the assumptions that make distance meaningful. In physics, you hit the Planck scale and your coordinates fail. In meditation, you hit the insect and your identity fails. Different languages, same boundary, same gate. I opened my eyes and looked at the world, the ordinary world of pigeons and exhaust and people carrying lunchboxes, and it looked suddenly like a code. Not because it was fake, because it was held. Held by constraints I could not see. Held by attention I could barely control. Held by something that did not need to announce itself as God. My phone buzzed with a final message from Saraswati. I looked. It was a single line. Note: decoding process is non-unique. Many corpora produce partial matches. Selected output maximizes semantic resonance with user history. I stared at it. Semantic resonance, user history, my history. The AI was telling me politely what my guru had warned. You will mistake the map for the territory, or you will become proud of your map. I laughed, a short, raw sound, because the most unsettling possibility was now inescapable. What if the universe is not trying to send me a message? What if the universe is a silent, vast equation, and the sound current is simply what it feels like when a conscious system aligns with its deepest constraints? And if so, then the creator is not a voice outside, not a particle inside, but the unprovable axiom that makes any voice, any particle, any proof possible, tiny as an insect, crowning worlds. And when I finally stopped trying to seize it, the door opened, not to a throne, not to a face, not even to an answer, but to emptiness so complete it felt like home. 13. I went back to the Institute that afternoon and did something that would have amused my grandfather more than any mystical revelation. I opened a spreadsheet, not the romantic kind of spreadsheet, the kind that kills delusions by forcing them into columns. I titled it Insect Protocol. Mira found me in the lab's kitchenette staring at it like a man preparing his own execution. You look sick, she said. I'm trying to be honest, I replied. Mira poured coffee without asking. That's worse than being sick. I laughed once, thinly, and slid the printout of Saraswati's note across the table. Selected output maximizes semantic resonance with user history. Mira read it, then set the paper down with careful fingers like it might bite. So, she said, the machine is confessing to personalization. Or accusing me of projection, I said. Mira's eyes narrowed. Both can be true, but we don't guess. We design the next step. Anaya walked in behind her, hair tied up, eyes bright with the manic joy she reserved for experiments that could ruin our reputations. We pre-register, Anaya announced as if declaring a festival. Mira gave her a look. We were about to. Anaya grinned. Good. I already wrote a draft. I stared at them. You two are taking this seriously. Mira's expression was flat. Dev, you are not the first person in history to hear something in noise and feel chosen. The only difference is you have the self-awareness to be frightened by it. Anaya's grin softened. Also, it's genuinely interesting. We moved into the conference room and did what mystics rarely do at the start of a spiritual quest. We wrote an experimental plan that assumed we were wrong. We pre-registered primary hypothesis, meditation condition, modulates measurable features of syndrome time, series beyond controls. Secondary hypothesis, EEG/MEG features during reported inner sound episodes correlate with syndrome features, temporal alignment, spectral similarity, beyond chance. Null hypothesis, any apparent correlation arises from confounds, data dredging, or interpretive mapping artifacts. We specified exact metrics, syndrome spectral power in defined bands, phase-locking value between syndrome-derived hum mode and physiological rhythms, breathing heart rate, compression-based motif recurrence rates using a fixed algorithm and fixed parameter set, EEG cross-frequency coupling indices with a locked pre-processing pipeline. We specified exact stopping rules. We specified blinding. Andrea would not see condition labels until after analysis. Mira would review hardware logs without knowing my subjective reports. I would not see intermediate correlation results because my attention was already too eager to please. When we finished, Mira leaned back and looked at me over the rim of her coffee mug. "This is how you respect the unknown," she said, "by refusing to let it use you." Andrea added, almost gently, "and by refusing to let you use it." I thought of the poem again, sound penetrating to the crown jewel, and I thought, if attention is the insect, then pre-registration is pesticide. The thought made me laugh, and for the first time in weeks, the laugh felt like mine. 3 days later, Mira introduced me to Dr. Omar Qureshi. He was a visiting theorist from a place people in our field name the way believers name holy cities. Perimeter, IAS, Princeton, depending on what kind of pilgrim they were. Omar didn't look like a mystic or a saint. He looked like a man who had argued with too many blackboards and lost. Mira brought him into our group meeting and said, "This is Dev. He's been doing something unusual." Omar shook my hand, eyes scanning me like a detector. "Unusual in physics is normal," he said. "Unusual in student life is also normal. Unusual in grant proposals is dangerous." Andrea smiled brightly. Omar's gaze lingered on her with polite wariness. Mira gave him the sanitized version. Holographic codes, syndrome dynamics, the hum, the odd appearance of Tulsi Sahib text under certain decodings. Omar listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "So your anomaly is a compression algorithm plus a semantic mapping plus a human primed by poetry yields poetry." "That's one interpretation," Mira said. Omar nodded. "It's the simplest." Andrea leaned forward. "Simplest doesn't mean correct." Omar's mouth twitched. "True, but it usually means less embarrassing." I should have disliked him. Instead, I felt relief. Because Omar was the voice in my head that refused to kneel. He turned to me. "Dev, why are you doing this?" I opened my mouth, then closed it. My first impulse, truth, sounded childish, so I told him the more honest version. "I heard something," I said, "in the machine. And I heard something in meditation. They felt structurally similar. Then I read Tulsi Sahib. It fit too well, and the fit scared me." Omar nodded slowly. "Good. Fear is a sign you still have a brain." He stood and walked to our whiteboard, erasing a corner without asking permission, an act that in our department was either confidence or violence. He wrote, "Map not equal territory." Then he drew a diagram, a big circle labeled world, and inside it a smaller circle labeled model, and inside that an even smaller circle labeled observer. He tapped the smallest circle. "If your observer tries to prove the entire world from inside their own model," he said, "they run into something like incompleteness. Not necessarily Gödel's theorem directly, but a family resemblance. Self-reference creates blind spots." He looked at me. "Mystical traditions often discover the same thing with different language. They call the blind spot the ego, the insect, the I." My skin prickled. Omar continued, "So here's what I'd propose as a clean theoretical framing, free of gods and poetry." He wrote, "Conjecture. The sub-Planck regime is not smaller geometry, it is the failure of geometric description. Fundamental object equals constraint slash inference slash code. Then he underlined inference and looked at Anaya. She grinned as if he'd just offered her a gift. And if, Omar said, turning back to me, your inner practices modulate the observer model, reduce its rigidity, reduce its prediction error, then you might experience that failure of geometry as a tower of emptiness. Mira folded her arms. And the sound current? Omar shrugged. Spectral phenomena show up everywhere. Modular flow, entanglement spectra, neural oscillations. The brain likes rhythms. A good metaphor does not require a cosmic transmitter. Anaya said, but the correlations, if they replicate, still demand explanation. Omar nodded. Yes, that explanation might be banal coupling or hidden confounders, or it might be something deeper about how measurement, inference, and code interact. Then he looked at me, and his tone softened, almost imperceptibly. Dev, he said, be careful. Your tradition tells you there is a sound. Your science tells you there is noise. The dangerous place is where you want the sound to win. I swallowed. Omar's eyes were calm, not mocking. Let them both be hypotheses, he said, and keep your life bigger than this question. That last sentence hit me harder than the rest, because my life had been shrinking toward the lab, toward the tone, toward the insect.